Hi folks, after speaking to a few friends and acquaintances, I have been asked to make a few videos about the basics of photography, starting from exposure, depth of field, understanding lenses and so on, which I think is a pretty good idea because there are literally thousands of videos on YouTube about gear and lenses and what looks best if you magnify it 10,000 times and look in the corner with a magnifying glass at sunset and that sort of thing. So let's stop satisfying the gear whores and focus more on the beginners, pardon the pun. So basically, basics of photography. Let's start off with exposure. Now, in the days of film, you used to get film at 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and sometimes people who needed to be able to photograph in low light conditions, like reporters or so on, they would get a very fast film. The higher the ISO of the film, the more sensitive it is to light. So reporters would often take ISO 1600 film and push process it, which is to develop it for longer to bring out that image because there wasn't enough light. They would push process it 1 stop to 32 or 2 stops to 6400, but there was a price to pay for that, which was increased grain in the images. But if it were for a press photo or something important, that didn't matter. And as you may have seen when you look at some of these old images, that grain was charismatic of film and is actually part of its beauty. Now, moving on to digital, there's been massive advances in the sensitivity of digital sensors from over the last decade, and now many cameras can create fantastic images at 32 or even 64 ISO 6400, which is literally unbelievable. These things can practically see in the dark now, but you still require an understanding of the basics of exposure. There are 3 factors that dictate the exposure of an image: the amount of light passing through the lens, the actual shutter speed, which is the length of time the shutter is open, allowing that light to hit the sensor, because the longer the shutter is open, the more light can actually hit the sensor, and the sensitivity of the sensor. Now, with regard to the sensitivity of the sensor, or ISO, nothing is for free. And even though sensors do can actually capture images in much lower light at much better quality, no matter what you do, as you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, you are also increasing the noise, which is basically, when you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, you're not making it more sensitive, it is purely applied gain. The best way to describe this is like playing a track that's not very loud, that's at low volume, and you turn the volume up beyond what you would normally turn it up so you can hear the track, which you often can, but along with increasing the volume of the track, you get a lot of hiss come with it because you have turned up all of the electronic noise in the background that you would not have normally heard. In photographic terms, that happens as well when you increase the sensitivity of a sensor. Now, although they have got fantastic, and what used to be noticeable at ISO 1600 10 years ago is not noticeable now at 64 or even 12,800, there is in effect still a deterioration as you increase the ISO. But again, if it means getting the image, it doesn't matter. And then there's all the things you can do afterwards on your PC with Photoshop and noise reducing to actually improve the image. With regard to the lens, most people when they buy a camera, it comes with a kit lens, something like this. This for a kit lens is actually very good because it ranges between 2.8 and f4. Most kit lenses are basically 3.5 to 5.6. That is the amount of light that passes through the lens. And if we take a starting point of 1, every time you multiply the f-stop number by 1.4, you are halving the light that passes through the lens. That's a totally different subject that you can go and Google if you want to. It's not something I'll go through here. Hence the reason that if you have a lens that does have f-stops on the actual lens, you'll notice these familiar numbers: 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. If you sit down with a calculator, you'll establish that each change is multiplying the previous number by 1.4. So every time you close one stop down on your lens from f2 to 2.8 or 2.8 to f4, you are halving the light that goes through the lens. Now, to get the correct exposure, if you close down the lens one stop, whatever your shutter speed is, to get the same exposure, you would have to double your shutter speed, so double the time. So if your shutter speed is 1/60th, if you close down your lens one stop, you would have to open up the shutter so that it stays open for 1/30th of a second instead of 1/60th, meaning the shutter stays open for twice as long, allowing twice as much light to come through. So the light, that even though there's less light coming through the lens, the shutter stays open for twice as long, so the exposure would remain the same. But the image would look slightly different because as you open the lens or close the lens, the amount of area that remains in focus, called the depth of field, changes, which is something I will go into in the next video. So basically 3 things: shutter speed, ISO, and the f-stop of the lens. Those 3 factors are what control the exposure of a lens. Now, for example, there are situations where people want the lens wide open and they want the fastest shutter speed possible to freeze action, football, sports, that sort of thing. There are other situations where people are not concerned about the speed of the shutter, but they are more concerned about closing down the lens as much as possible, again, for the depth of field reason, to get more area in focus, such as landscape photographers or architectural photographers. Hence the reason that you see them often mount their camera on a tripod. They could take a photograph without a tripod, but they wouldn't be able to close down the lens that much, because to close down the lens that much without increasing the ISO, which degrades the image quality, they have to reduce the shutter speed. And sometimes if people want the shutter open for a great length of time, 1 second, 10 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, they need to be on a tripod. There are times when I actually purposely want a shutter open for a long time, and I have something called a neutral density filter which goes on the front of my lens, which cuts down the light even more so that I can put my camera on a tripod. I can have a long exposure, which means during the time of the exposure the clouds move so they get blurred, or if it's a river or the sea, it moves, and that's how you get those creamy blurred ocean photos, whereas everything else is pin sharp and anything that moves is blurred. This is all done by using creative blur, motion blur. Then you have creative focus blur, which is, again, comes with depth of field, which I'll explain in the next video, by opening the lens right up. So if you are a beginner, or if you are looking into getting more serious and more creative with your photography, to be honest, any half decent digital camera that has been available in the last few years is good enough. As I've often said in my videos, the order of importance with photography is creativity, light, lens, camera. Camera comes last. The most important, first and foremost, is creativity. If you are creative, you will get an artistic image, something beautiful, no matter what you take it with. And bear in mind that no matter what camera you have, no matter what it is, you will have a camera that is better, far better than anything available to some of the great photographic greats of the past. Margaret Bourke-White, or I've forgotten the others, but there's some really highly regarded photographers from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Ansel Adams, that's another one. Anything that you can buy now is better than what these people had, and yet they created fantastic images, because the image is not all about whether you can see a speck of grain under a microscope. It is the effect, the whole image as you look at it. So with regard to exposure, it's those three things: the lens, the aperture of the lens, the shutter speed, sensitivity of the sensor. There's no point me going into figures too much here, because I'll just be waffling on, and they're all available online. But if you actually sit down and read through it again and again and again to get it clear in your head so you digest it, once you are clear about the triangle of exposure, it becomes really simple. And then you are able to take a camera, put it in manual. Especially now with the beauty of digital, you don't have to wait for your film to be processed to look if you got it right or if you got it wrong. You can take an image, you can bracket, which is you can take an image and you can adjust the exposure up or down, 3 or 4 stops each way, to make sure that you have got one that is perfectly exposed. It's digital. Keep the best one, delete the others. That is the only way to learn to experiment. Now, for me, as I said, kit lenses do have their place when you just want your camera, you don't want to be messing around changing lenses, you don't know what you're going to be photographing. This one in particular is very good, and it's great for video because it has image stabilization as well. But for the creative side of things, I like fast lenses because they can let in a lot of light. And if you think about it, this one here, which is a beautiful old portrait lens, this is an f1.4 lens. Now, if you think that you may have a kit lens that's f3.5, and as you zoom in, it goes all the way down to f5.6, be it the Nikon or the Canon one or whatever, they're 18 to 50 or whatever they are, 18 to 55. At the 55 end, they close down to f5.6. This is a 58mm lens, and this is a 1.4. If you think 1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, that's 4 stops of light difference. But it's not just the amount of light. It is with this, if you photograph somebody and take a portrait, a headshot, their eyes will be in focus. When it's wide open, their eyes will be in focus and their ears will be blurred. That gives that beautiful creative separation. Or if you're photographing something that you want to isolate outdoors, you can go close up, open the lens right up, and you can get your chosen subject clearly in focus, and everything behind it will be blurred. I love doing things like that, which is why I tend to be a prime shooter. And recently I've tried these lenses, which is from a new company that's only started making lenses in the last couple of years, but I take my hat off to them. They really have worked wonders here. This is a 35mm, but this is a 1.2. It's not that long ago that there was only a handful of lenses that open that much in, you know, in the whole world. Just a handful, one or two from Nikon, one or two from Canon, not many, and they were ridiculously expensive. Now, although this is not in the same caliber of lenses as Leica and Zeiss, it's still very, very good, and for what I want, this is actually beautiful. Such a clever design. It's small, it has a beautiful feel to it, it has a long range of focusing so that I can easily focus manually where I want it to focus, and it lets in an amazing amount of light, and it has minimal area that's in focus. Yes, of course, if you want to be what I call a gear whore and you want to take an image from this and a Zeiss lens and you want to magnify them 200% and look in the corners, you're going to see there's a section in the corner that's going to be slightly sharper than this one, although this is pretty good, but still slightly sharper from the more expensive lenses, but that is irrelevant in the context of an entire image. That doesn't matter, and for the main part, that's in an area that for most people is going to be blurred anyway. The only time that sort of thing matters is for technical photographers, architectural photographers, that sort of thing. And this lens is actually not too bad, but that's not what you would be using for that sort of thing. Then you have this one, which is a very wide lens, and this is an f2, which is brilliant for such a wide lens. Again, never used to be able to get lenses this wide, this fast, and this is beautiful because not only being wide does it mean that there's a large area that's in focus normally, but when I can open it, when I open the lens right up and go somewhere close, I can get that beautiful ultra wide distortion, which exaggerates everything, and yet in the distance I can still get some blur. So it's actually very good. It's probably my favorite lens, this is. So there's a lot to take in with the exposure triangle, but I would definitely recommend that you take the time to actually read up and actually get your head around it. It won't take long, but once you have got your head around it, then you can arm yourself with any camera, put it on manual, and you can everything on manual and go out there and change settings one by one until you actually understand it completely and it becomes second nature to you. That will be a massive leap forward in your photography, because you will understand how to get things exposed correctly. Then you can look into why, for example, the last hour before the sun goes down, it's called the golden hour. For many reasons, the colours are warm because as the sun goes down, the temperature drops, the colour temperature, and everything becomes more red and has a beautiful tone to it. The angle of the light is much more flattering than that horrid midday sun, and also as it becomes less bright, then you can get more of the image exposed correctly. In the middle of the day, if you've got a dark foreground and a really bright sky, there's no way this sensor on any camera can expose correctly for the foreground and the sky. Hence the reason that some people bracket and they take several photographs on a tripod and then merge them together in Photoshop so that they can expose for the sky and the foreground and blend it together. As the sun goes down and the sky's not as bright, that's where you can actually get detail in the foreground and still get detail in the sky. Or if you're photographing a cityscape, if you photograph it late at night, you can see the buildings but the sky's just black. If you do it in the middle of the day to expose for the buildings, the sky can be burnt out, but in the last hour before sunset you can expose for the buildings and you can still get detail in the sky, which is how professional photographers sometimes get those beautiful images where everything is exposed correctly. It's about timing and understanding exposure, and the difference between the lightest area of an image that a sensor can record and the darkest area of an image is referred to as dynamic range. And even now, in this day and age, the dynamic range of a camera does not come anywhere near to the dynamic range that our eyes have. Obviously, because our brain adjusts what we see as we look in different directions, so we can look from somewhere dark to somewhere light. Granted, if you go from dark to light very quickly, it can take time for your eyes to adjust, but they can adjust. Whereas when you take a photograph, it is an equal exposure throughout the whole image for that split second that you've taken the photograph. So there's only so much that can actually be exposed within that range. But if you do research it, you will get your head around it, and it is definitely worth it, because once you've got your head around it, it will improve your photography forever. So that's all for this video. It's gone on for a lot longer than what I intended, but hopefully this will help, and I shall be back with another one on focusing and depth of field soon. Bye.